were standing down the search as of tomorrow morning. Silas Hargrove didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at the man in the gray suit who'd said it like he was reading a weather report. She's a combat medic. 6 days on that mountain means nothing to a woman trained to survive it. The decision's already been finalized. 6 ridgelines above them, Nora Vance was still breathing. Broken ankle, 3 cracked ribs, 4 rounds left in a weapon she'd been rationing like water, and a piece of military radio equipment in her pocket carrying a serial number that shouldn't exist, 'cause it belonged to a unit her father served in. The same unit blacked out of the report that said he died in Iraq 19 years ago. They'd told her it was an accident. They'd told Silas to sign it. And somewhere on that ridge, armed men were converging on the one person alive who could prove otherwise.
The wind came off the ridge like it had a grudge. Nora Vance felt it before she heard it, a change in pressure, a shift in the pines below the observation post that made the needles hiss instead of whisper. She didn't move her head, didn't need to. Her eyes tracked the tree line through the scope without her body giving anything away. Stillness was a skill. Her father used to say that. Said it like it was nothing, like breathing, because it wasn't nothing. Nora exhaled. Slow. Counted the beats between heartbeats the way she'd been taught since she was 9 years old, sitting cross-legged on cold granite while her grandfather adjusted her elbow, her stance, her grip. He never raised his voice. Never had to. Steady is a decision, he used to tell her, not a gift. She held the rifle level, watched a mule deer step out of the brush 200 yards downslope. Just a deer, not a threat. She lowered the scope anyway, out of habit more than necessity, and let her shoulders drop an inch. She remembered the first time her grandfather put a rifle in her hands. 9 years old. Too small for the stock, really, the recoil pad nearly reaching her collarbone, and he'd laughed, not unkindly, and adjusted her grip instead of telling her to wait until she was older. Most people think shooting's about the finger, he'd told her. It's not. It's about everything before the finger. The breath, the heartbeat, the decision to be calm when your whole body wants to be anything else. What if I'm scared? She'd asked. Then you're steady anyway, he'd said. Steady is a decision, not a gift. Don't ever let anybody tell you it's a gift. Gifts run out. Decisions you can make again every single time you need one. She'd carried that sentence through 2 deployments, through a divorce that never happened, only because she'd never let a relationship get close enough to risk one, through 6 years of a quiet so total it sometimes felt like its own kind of exile. She carried it now at 26, alone, in a steel container on a Wyoming ridge, because some inheritances don't come wrapped in paper. Some just live in the muscles waiting to be needed. The observation post was a steel container disguised as a maintenance shed tucked into the shoulder of a ridge in the Wind River Range, 40 minutes from anything that could be called a town. Wyoming didn't do subtlety. Just distance, just silence stacked on more silence until silence became its own kind of weather. Nora liked it that way. Until she didn't. Because 6 years of quiet does something to a person. It doesn't heal you. People like to say that. Time heals. Except it doesn't heal anything. It just buries it deeper, packs the dirt down tighter and waits for something to come along with a shovel. She hadn't touched a shovel in 6 years. Until this morning. The message came in at 0600, routed through the relay tower on Pilot Peak, stamped with a classification level that made her blink twice before she opened it. Facility Maintenance Sensor Array 7 offline, 41 hours. Investigate and report. 41 hours? That wasn't a glitch. Glitches came back in minutes. Glitches apologized for themselves. 41 hours was something choosing to stay dark. Nora sat with the message a long moment, the container's fluorescent light humming overhead, and felt something cold slide down the back of her neck that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Because Sensor Array 7 wasn't just any relay point. Sensor Array 7 sat 2 ridge lines over from the coordinates in a folder she wasn't supposed to have. A folder her father had left behind. She'd found it 8 months ago. Not looking for it, not really. just going through the last of the boxes her mother had finally sent after years of, "I'll get to it, Nora, I promise," boxes that smelled like a closet in Fort Riley, Kansas. A life packed away and never unpacked again. Photographs, medals nobody displayed, a folded flag that still made her chest cave in a little every time she saw it. 6 years old or 60 didn't matter. Some things don't get easier. And underneath all of it, a file. Government issue, edges soft from handling, tape gone brittle and yellow. Operation Crosscut, Marcus Vance, Captain, U.S. Army. Killed in action during a training incident. Anbar Province, 2007. Except the file wasn't a training file. It was an incident report, redacted so heavily it looked like a ransom note. Blacked out names, blacked out unit designations, one line left untouched almost by accident, like whoever scrubbed it had gotten tired near the bottom of the page. Site coordinates match relay station construction, Wind River Range, Wyoming. See attached. There was no attachment. Nora had read that line maybe 200 times since, turned it over in her hands like a stone she couldn't skip across water. Her father died in Iraq. That was the story. That was the whole story. Had been the whole story for 19 years, carved into a headstone at Arlington that she visited twice and then never again, because visiting it made the lie feel more real, not less. Except a coordinate doesn't lie. A coordinate just sits there, patient, waiting for someone to finally ask why. There was a second document in that folder too, one she hadn't let herself think about often, because thinking about it too long made her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with confusion. A commendation letter, dated 18 months before her father died, signed by a colonel whose name she didn't recognize. Captain Vance's actions during the Fallujah extraction saved my life and the lives of 3 other men under my command. I owe him a debt I intend to spend the rest of my career repaying. She'd read that line as many times as the other one. A man her father had saved, a man who owed him a debt. She didn't know back then that a debt could curdle, that gratitude held long enough in the wrong hands could turn into something closer to fear. She only knew the letter existed, unexplained, sitting beside a redacted death report like 2 halves of a story nobody had bothered to stitch together. She hadn't told anyone. Not command, not her mother, who'd remarried, who'd built a version of peace out of not asking questions. And Nora wasn't about to be the one who kicked that down. Not Silas, especially not Silas. Because Silas Hargrove would want to know why she was asking, and once he started asking why, he wouldn't stop. That was the thing about old medics. They didn't know how to leave a wound alone. They had to keep pressing until they found where it actually hurt. She'd known Silas her whole life, in the peripheral way a kid knows her father's friends a shape at the edge of birthday parties, a name mentioned over Thanksgiving, a man who sent a card every year on the anniversary and never signed anything but "still thinking of you both." 6 years ago, when she came back from her last deployment with her hands shaking in a way they'd never shaken before, it was Silas who showed up, uninvited, unasked. Just appeared on her porch in Cheyenne with a thermos of coffee and nothing to say, and somehow that was exactly the right amount of something. He'd gotten her the security contract out here, told her the mountains would either fix her or finish the job, and either way at least it'd be quiet while it happened. He didn't know about the folder. Nobody knew about the folder. Until Sensor Array 7 went dark for 41 hours at the exact coordinates her father's file couldn't quite let go of. Nora packed light. Instinct, not planning. Water. A trauma kit that never left her side out here or anywhere. Her sidearm, the old bolt action her grandfather gave her the year before he passed. More sentiment than sense, but sentiment had weight too. She left a note. Not a real one, just a line on the whiteboard by the door. Checking Array 7, back by dark. N. The kind of note you write when you don't expect to need it read. She radioed the relief contractor before she left, a younger man named P.D. Doss, who covered weekends and always sounded a little too eager to talk, like the isolation got to him faster than it got to her. "You want me to come along?" he asked, static crackling under his voice. "Sounds like it could be a two-person job." "It's a broken sensor, Petey, not an invasion." 41 hours is a long time for a sensor to just sit there broken. She hesitated at that. Just a half second, long enough that if he'd been standing in front of her instead of speaking through a radio, he might have seen something cross her face. "I'll call it in if it's anything more," she said. "Back by dark." "Copy that. Stay sharp up there." "Always do." She clipped the radio to her belt and told herself Petey was just a talker, that his nerves were just the ordinary kind that came with the job, not some early warning she was choosing to ignore. Except some part of her, the part that had read a redacted file 200 times, knew the difference between ordinary nerves and the kind that came from something real. She just didn't want to look at it yet. Not before coffee. Not before she'd even left the ridge. The trail up to Array 7 wasn't a trail, not officially. It was a supply route cut through lodgepole pine 40 years ago and never maintained since, switchbacking up a slope steep enough to make her thighs burn by the second mile. She liked the burn. The burn meant something was working the way it should. 2 hours in the trees thinned. The wind picked up the way it always did above 9,000 feet, sharp enough to cut through the flannel layer under her jacket, and Nora pulled her collar up without breaking stride, because that's when she felt it. The wrongness. Not a sound. Not exactly. More like the absence of sound where there should have been some. No birds, no wind through needles the way there had been an hour ago. Just a held breath spread across an entire mountainside. She stopped, crouched, scanned the ridge above her the way her grandfather taught her, section by section, not looking for movement, but looking for the places where movement was being hidden. Nothing. Except everything in her told her that was wrong. That nothing was the wrongest thing of all. "Stop," she told herself. "You're spiraling. 6 years of quiet does this. Makes ghosts out of wind." Except ghosts didn't leave boot prints. There, 20 feet off the trail, half swallowed by a patch of unmelted snow in the shadow of a boulder. A print. Fresh. Deep tread, military patterned sole toe pointed uphill toward Array 7, toward exactly where she was headed. Her hand found the sidearm at her hip without her telling it to. She thought, standing there, of the last conversation she'd had with her mother about her father. 6 months ago. Christmas, of all times, both of them a little too warmed by wine, her mother's guard down enough to say something she probably regretted the next morning. "He wrote to a colonel," her mother had said, "before he died. I found the letter years later, half burned in the fireplace like he'd started to destroy it and changed his mind. I never understood why he'd want to burn a letter to a man he saved." "What did it say?" Nora had asked. Her mother had looked at her a long moment, the wine glass trembling slightly in her hand. "It said he was worried the program had stopped being what it was supposed to be, that the man he saved wasn't the man he remembered anymore." Nora hadn't slept that night. She still hadn't fully slept, not really, not in 6 months, the sentence looping in her head at 3 in the morning, more nights than she wanted to count. The man he saved wasn't the man he remembered anymore. She hadn't known, standing on that trail with a fresh boot print in the snow, that she was about to meet that man. Not yet. Not for 6 more days. But some part of her, the trained part, the part that read terrain and read silence and read the small tells that separated safety from danger, already understood that whatever waited at the top of this mountain wasn't going to be simple. Nothing about her father's death had ever been simple. Why would this be any different? The relay tower stood at the top of a bald outcrop, a steel lattice reaching 40 feet into a sky gone the color of a healing bruise, storm clouds building fast over the western peaks, the way they did up here, no warning, no mercy. The equipment shed at its base sat with the door hanging open, not forced, not broken, opened, by someone with a key. Nora went still at the tree line 30 yards out, every part of her that had once worn a uniform coming back online, at once adrenaline sharpening the world into edges and angles. Because a maintenance failure doesn't unlock its own door.
She waited, counted 60 seconds, counted them again. No movement, no sound, but the wind starting to build ahead of the storm, and her own pulse loud in her ears, betraying her the way pulses always did when it mattered most that they didn't. She moved. Low. Fast. The kind of fast that looked slow if you didn't know what you were watching. For weight rolling heel to toe, sidearm up, eyes sweeping the ridgeline in the 2-second windows between steps. The shed was empty. Equipment gutted. Not stolen, dismantled, precise. Someone had known exactly what they were looking for and exactly how to take it apart. Wires cut clean instead of ripped. Casing set aside instead of smashed. This wasn't vandalism, this was extraction. And on the workbench, sitting there like it wanted to be found, sat a single black case. Government issue. The same matte finish as a dozen things she remembered from her own service. She opened it. Empty. Except for one thing, a radio, military band. The serial number partially scratched off, but not all the way because whoever did it had been in a hurry, and hurry always left something behind. Nora's stomach dropped before her mind caught up to why. Because she recognized that serial prefix. It wasn't civilian contractor issue. It wasn't even current generation army. It was hers. The units. The very unit her father had served in, the one blacked out of his file. The one that supposedly hadn't existed in any operational capacity since. The first gunshot took the corner off the workbench, 6 inches from her hand. She was moving before the sound finished echoing. Training didn't ask permission, it just happened. Body already rolling behind the equipment rack, sidearm coming up, mind doing the math her instructors had drilled into her 100 lifetimes ago. Angle of impact, distance from splinter to wood grain, elevation, high ground, west ridge, maybe 300 yards. A second shot cracked into the steel doorframe. Because someone knew I was coming. Except nobody knew I was coming, which means somebody's been watching this location a lot longer than 41 hours. She broke from cover in a crouch, cutting east toward the tree line, boots finding purchase on loose scree that wanted to send her sliding, and made it 3 strides before a third round clipped the granite, an arm's length from her shoulder, spraying rock dust into her cheek. Close. Too close. That wasn't luck, that was a spotter. Which meant this wasn't one shooter, which meant this was a team. The trees swallowed her a half-second later, and Nora didn't stop, didn't look back, every cell in her body screaming the same word over and over, move, move, move. Behind her, distantly, she heard something that made the hair on her arms rise, even through the adrenaline. A voice. Male, calm, almost bored the way professionals sound when panic isn't part of the job description. Targets mobile. Converge, east flank. Not local law, not poachers, not hikers who'd panicked and started shooting. She thought absurdly of Petey's voice on the radio an hour earlier. 41 hours is a long time for a sensor to just sit there broken. She should have called it in. Should have told him to alert someone, anyone, before she climbed a mountain toward a coordinate her father's ghost had been circling for 19 years. Except, calling it in meant explaining the folder. And explaining the folder meant admitting she'd been carrying a redacted file in her head for 8 months, instead of handing it to the people whose job it was to investigate things like this. Too late for that regret now. Regret didn't stop bullets. Converge. That was a word from a briefing room. That was a word from her own vocabulary learned in classrooms with government seals on the walls. She was being hunted by people who spoke her language. The storm broke over the ridge like something had been holding it back on purpose, waiting for exactly this moment to let go. Rain came sideways, freezing at this elevation, turning the slope beneath her boots into something closer to a river than a trail. Nora went down once, hard, felt her ankle twist wrong beneath her and swallowed the sound that wanted to come out of her throat, biting down until she tasted copper because sound was the one thing she couldn't afford right now. She got up. Because staying down wasn't a choice that existed for her. Not anymore. Not after everything the mountain had already taken and given back changed. Lightning cracked somewhere close enough to whiten the whole slope for half a second, and in that half second she saw them.
Two shapes, maybe three, moving through the tree line above her with the kind of discipline that didn't come from hunting deer. Tactical spacing, overlapping fields of fire, not amateurs, which means whoever sent them knew exactly who they were sending after. Which means this isn't about the sensor array at all. The thought hit her like the second lightning strike sharper than the first, and for one unsteady heartbeat, Nora Vance stopped running from the men behind her and started running from the truth ahead of her. This is about the file. This is about my father. This is about a coordinate that was never supposed to lead anywhere. A round tore through a branch a foot above her head, close enough that bark rained down across her shoulders, and every thought scattered except one, the only one that mattered now. Survive. Figure out why, later. Survive, first. She found the ravine by accident, a crack in the mountain barely wide enough for her shoulders, cut by decades of snowmelt, and she went into it sideways, wedging herself down between wet stone walls as the storm screamed overhead and the shouting above her grew muffled, distant, uncertain. For a long moment, all she could hear was her own breath, ragged, too loud in the narrow space. Quiet, she told herself. Quiet or dead, pick one. She pressed her palm flat against the stone and forced her lungs to slow, counting the way her grandfather taught her. 4 in hold for 4, 4 out until her heartbeat stopped trying to climb out of her chest. Footsteps passed above the ravine. Close, 2 sets maybe. Radios crackled somewhere just out of clear hearing, words swallowed by rain except for one phrase that carried down through the crack in the rock with terrible clarity. No visual. Command wants confirmation before extraction. Extraction. Like she was cargo, like this had already been decided somewhere far above this mountain long before she ever climbed it. The footsteps moved on, faded. The storm kept screaming, and Nora kept counting her breath in the dark alone, wedged into stone understanding with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that whatever she had walked into today was bigger than a broken sensor and older than she was. She thought of the note on the whiteboard, back by dark. Except dark had already come, and she wasn't back. She thought too of the 2 documents in that folder, the redacted death report and the commendation letter, and how they'd always felt like 2 halves of something that refused to fit together. She understood now, crouched in the dark, cold water seeping through her boots, that they weren't 2 halves of the same story at all. They were the beginning and the end of a betrayal that had taken 19 years to finish. She thought of her father's hands. Not the way they looked in photographs, steady, confident, a captain's hands. The way they felt instead. The one time she could actually remember them tucking a blanket around her shoulders on a camping trip when she was 6. The last trip they ever took together, before the deployments swallowed the rest of his life, and then swallowed him whole. You're safe, he'd told her that night, the fire crackling low, her small hand disappearing inside his. I've got you. She'd believed him completely, the way 6-year-olds believe things without question, without the need for evidence. 20 years later, wedged into a wet stone crack with a twisted ankle and 3 armed men somewhere above her, Nora understood for the first time that her father's promise had never actually been about that camping trip at all. It had been about everything after it. Every year she wouldn't get to have him in, every version of I've got you that a folded flag and a headstone were supposed to replace and never quite managed to. She pressed her palm against the stone one more time, feeling for a pulse that belonged to the mountain instead of to her own chest, and made herself a promise of her own, quiet, fierce, the kind that didn't need an audience to be real. Whatever this is, whatever they buried with you, Dad, I'm not leaving it buried too. And nobody, she realized with a cold certainty that settled into her bones alongside the mountain chill, nobody even knew to be worried yet. Silas Hargrove noticed the coffee first. 2 mugs, cold, untouched since morning, sitting on the counter of the ranger substation where he did his own quiet version of retirement, coordinating trail maintenance for a forest service that mostly left him alone, which suited him fine because being left alone was the closest thing to peace he'd found since his own uniform came off for the last time. He noticed the coffee and something in the back of his skull, some old alarm that had never fully powered down in 40 years made him check the radio log before he even knew why. Sensor Array 7, offline. 41 hours. Nora Vance dispatched. No return contact logged. His hand found his phone before conscious thought caught up, because Nora didn't miss check-ins. Not once. Not in 6 years. She'd built her whole rebuilt life around discipline, around routine, around the kind of precision that left no room for anyone to worry about her, which he'd always privately understood as its own kind of wound, wearing armor made of competence, so nobody would ask what was underneath it. She missed her check-in. The line rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Silas stood in the small kitchen of a substation that suddenly felt too quiet, too still. The same wrongness she would have recognized instantly if she'd been standing where he stood and something in his chest. Old, familiar, worn smooth by 2 decades of trying not to feel it cracked open just slightly. Not again, he thought. Not her, too. The official search started fast and quiet the way these things always did when the person missing had clearance levels attached to her name. 2 Forest Service trucks, a pair of state troopers who didn't ask too many questions because someone above their pay grade had already told them not to, and within 6 hours a man in a gray suit who introduced himself only as Reyes and produced credentials that made the troopers straighten their spines a little. Silas didn't like Reyes. Didn't like him from the first handshake, the kind too firm, too rehearsed a grip, built to project confidence instead of earn it. Reyes had gone up to Area 7 himself the second day, with 2 of his own people and a photographer, who documented the gutted equipment shed like it was a crime scene, which Silas suspected it probably was. He'd come back down, quiet. Quieter than a man should be after finding evidence of a professional dismantling job in the middle of nowhere. "Find anything?" Silas asked him that evening, watching Reyes's face carefully. "Equipment failure," Reyes said, consistent with age and weather exposure. "That's not what a bullet hole in a steel door frame looks like." Reyes's jaw tightened just barely, just enough for a man trained to read faces the way Silas was trained to catch it. "There's no bullet hole in my report," Reyes said. "I didn't say there was one in your report. I asked if you found anything." "I found what the report says I found." Silas let that sit a moment, turning it over the way he'd turn over a suspicious mole, a wound that didn't match the story the patient was telling about how they got it. "Somebody's editing what you're allowed to see up there," Silas said, "aren't they?" Reyes didn't answer. But he didn't deny it either, and in Silas's experience, 40 years of reading soldiers and their silences, a man who doesn't deny something is a man who's already decided he can't afford to confirm it. "Ms. Vance's last known position was Array 7, Reyes said, standing at the trailhead with a tablet that looked more expensive than Silas's truck. "Weather's compromised most of the terrain. We'll do an aerial sweep at first light." "And tonight?" Silas asked. "Tonight we wait." Wait. The word sat wrong in Silas's mouth, wrong enough that he almost said something he'd regret, except 40 years of discipline held the words back the way it always had. The way it hadn't, once, a long time ago, when holding back would have mattered more. Because he knew what waiting meant on a mountain like this. Waiting meant hypothermia had time to work. Waiting meant injuries went untreated. Waiting meant every hour was a door quietly closing somewhere nobody was looking. He'd learned that lesson once already. 19 years ago, in a place far from these mountains, standing over a man he couldn't save fast enough because someone above his pay grade had also told him to wait. He wasn't going to learn it twice. The first night of the search, Silas didn't sleep. He sat at the small folding table in the command tent Reyes had set up at the trailhead, listening to radio chatter that told him nothing, watching a weather system roll across a topographic map like something with intent, and let his mind do what it hadn't done in years. He let himself remember Marcus Vance's face, not the last time he saw it, not the moment that still visited him some nights uninvited, but earlier, years earlier. A cookout at Fort Riley, Marcus laughing at something Silas couldn't remember anymore, A baby girl on his hip who would grow up to look exactly like him, down to the set of her jaw when she was concentrating on something that mattered. That baby's out there right now, Silas thought, 26 years old and hunted by something none of these people in this tent understand. He thought about telling Reyes what he knew about the file, about the coordinates, about a debt he'd carried so long it had stopped feeling like a debt and started feeling like a permanent piece of his own skeleton. He didn't. Because telling Reyes meant admitting things Silas wasn't ready to admit to a stranger in a gray suit, not before he'd said them to the one person who actually deserved to hear them first. Day 2 brought a helicopter one pass along the ridge before the weather closed back in, its searchlight sweeping granite and snow and finding nothing but the same empty white it had found the day before. Silas watched it from the trailhead, arms crossed, jaw tight, counting the minutes it stayed airborne, which wasn't nearly enough minutes for a search this size. "That's it?" he asked Reyes when the helicopter turned back. "One pass?" "Ceiling's dropping. Pilot made the call. The mountain doesn't care whose call it was." Reyes didn't answer that one. Silas hadn't expected him to. That night, Silas walked the perimeter of the search camp alone, unable to sit still, unable to sleep, running through every scenario his 40 years of training could produce. Nora hurt but mobile. Nora pinned down somewhere, waiting for a window. Nora hiding from something the official search wasn't even looking for because nobody in that camp except him understood there might be something up there worth hiding from. He found himself somewhere around 2 in the morning standing at the edge of the tree line, looking up at a ridge he couldn't see in the dark and talking to it the way a younger version of himself would have found ridiculous. "Hang on," he said, quiet, just for himself. "However you're doing it, just hang on." By day 3, the language started to shift. Silas heard it in the way the troopers talked among themselves near the trucks, in the careful phrasing Reyes used during the evening briefings. Probability of survivability, terrain hazard assessment, resource allocation, words built to make giving up sound like strategy. By day 4, the search area had shrunk. By day 5, it had shrunk again, folding inward like a map, being closed section by section until it was barely larger than the clearing around Array 7 itself. Silas stood at the edge of that clearing on the evening of day 5, rain long gone, the sky a hard, clean blue that felt almost cruel in its indifference, and listened to Reyes deliver the sentence he'd known was coming since the moment the word wait first left the man's mouth. "We're standing down the active search as of tomorrow morning," Reyes said, voice even, professional, a man reading a weather report instead of ending a life's chances. "Command's assessment is that survivability beyond 72 hours in this terrain, in this weather, is—" "She's a combat medic," Silas said. Quiet. Level. The voice he used when he needed people to actually hear him instead of just wait for their turn to speak. "She's spent 6 years training in exactly this terrain, in exactly this weather. If anyone on this mountain knows how to survive it, it's her." Reyes's expression didn't change, and that more than anything he said told Silas everything he needed to know about how this decision had actually been made, and by whom, and how little any of it had to do with survivability curves or resource allocation. "The decision's already been finalized," Reyes said. "I'm sorry." Silas had heard that word before, too, from men in suits, standing at the edges of clearings very much like this one, delivering decisions that had nothing to do with the person they were supposedly grieving. He'd believed it once. He wasn't going to believe it again. "Can I ask you something?" Silas said before Reyes could turn away. "Who authorized the stand down? Not the paperwork, the actual name." "That's not information I'm cleared to share." "Convenient. It's procedure." "Procedure didn't write itself, Reyes. Somebody signed it. And I'd bet my pension it's the same somebody who's got an interest in nobody finding what's actually up on that ridge." Reyes studied him a long moment, something flickering behind his professional composure that might have been discomfort, might have been the first honest thing the man had shown all week. "I just follow the file, Mr. Hargrove," he said finally. "I don't write it." "Then maybe it's time somebody did." Reyes walked away toward his own tent, and Silas watched him go, noticing the way the younger man's hand found his phone before he'd even reached the flap, noticing the careful distance he put between himself and anyone who might overhear the call. Silas didn't need to hear the words to understand the shape of the conversation. A man reporting up a chain that went higher than a Forest Service search coordinator had any business answering to. A man asking permission for decisions that should have belonged to him alone. Somewhere above Reyes, in an office or a briefing room or a phone line stretching all the way back to a name on a 19-year-old commendation letter, somebody was deciding how long a search for a missing woman was allowed to last. And that somebody Silas understood, with a certainty that settled cold and permanent into his chest, wasn't deciding based on weather or terrain or survivability curves at all. He turned back toward the substation, alone now, the camp's generator humming behind him, and went to retrieve the one thing in his possession that might actually make somebody answer for all of it. He walked away from the command tent before Reyes could answer out past the trucks, past the folding tables and the tablets, and the careful language built to make abandonment sound like wisdom, and stood alone at the edge of the trailhead where the pavement gave way to dirt, and the dirt gave way eventually to mountain. He thought about calling Nora's mother, decided against it. There was nothing to tell her yet that wouldn't just be cruelty dressed up as honesty, and Silas had delivered enough of that kind of honesty in his life to know better than to hand it out before it was earned. He thought about the folder instead, the one he didn't know Nora had found, though some instinct in him, some old soldier's sense for the shape of things, told him she must have found something. Must have gone looking, the way daughters of dead soldiers sometimes did sooner or later, whether anyone wanted them to or not. That night, alone in the substation, Silas pulled a box down from the closet shelf he hadn't opened in longer than he wanted to admit. Photographs. A folded letter he'd never had the courage to send. A name written on the front of an envelope in handwriting he still recognized after 19 years. Because some things a hand doesn't forget how to write no matter how much time passes. Marcus. He sat with the envelope a long moment, turning it over the way you turn over a stone you already know what's underneath, and let himself remember for the first time in years the exact sound of a training exercise going wrong in a way training exercises weren't supposed to go wrong. The exact color of the sky over Anbar Province that morning. The exact weight of a man's body when the weight stops meaning what it used to mean. He remembered, too, something he'd buried even deeper than the rest of it. A conversation weeks before the final validation run where Marcus had pulled him aside outside the mess tent, voice low, worried in a way Silas hadn't seen from him before. "Something's changed with Reeve," Marcus had said. "He's not the man I saved in Fallujah anymore. He's chasing something now. Funding, recognition. I don't like the way he's talking about the program." "Talk to Command," Silas had told him. "Command is Reeve," Marcus had said. "That's the problem." Silas hadn't thought much of it at the time. Soldiers complained about their commanders. It was practically liturgy. He hadn't understood not until 11 minutes of failed compressions on a training field that Marcus had been trying to tell him something that actually mattered. He'd promised himself he'd tell her someday. Marcus's daughter. Tell her what actually happened. What he'd seen. What he'd been told to say instead and had said for 19 years because saying the truth back then would have cost him everything he had left, and he'd been too much of a coward, or too broken, or maybe both, to pay that price. And now she's out there. On a mountain. Because of a folder she wasn't supposed to have. Because of coordinates that led back to me whether she knew it or not. Because I never told her the truth and the truth went looking for her instead. Silas set the letter down, stood, walked to the gun safe in the corner of the room he hadn't opened for anything but cleaning in over a decade, and turned the dial with hands that hadn't shaken like this since his last deployment. Because Command had made their decision. Because Reyes had his probability curves and his resource allocation and his tablet full of numbers designed to make abandonment sound like wisdom, except numbers didn't know Nora Vance. Numbers didn't know what 6 years of quiet, disciplined, relentless survival training actually built inside a person. And Numbers definitely didn't know what a 19-year-old debt felt like sitting unpaid in an old man's chest, finally demanding to be settled. Silas Hargrove was 66 years old. His knees ached in weather like this. His hands weren't what they used to be, and neither was his back, and neither, some mornings, was his nerve. But he knew this mountain, and he knew with a certainty that settled over him like the calm before the fastest sprints of his old life that he was the only person left who was actually going to look. He packed light, water, a trauma kit that hadn't been touched in years but had never once been thrown away, a rifle he hadn't fired since the day he retired it, oiled, now checked, chambered, and the letter, folded into his jacket pocket against his chest where it had waited 19 years to finally be carried somewhere that mattered. Before he left, he stood a long moment at the small desk in the corner of the substation, looking down at a photograph he kept there, one he rarely let himself study too closely. Marcus and Silas, younger, dust on their uniforms, arms slung over each other's shoulders in the easy way of men who trusted each other completely. "I made you a promise," he said out loud to the photograph, to the empty room. "I've spent 19 years failing to keep it. I'm not failing tonight." He left before dawn while Reyes and his people were still asleep in their rented rooms 40 minutes down the mountain, dreaming probably of clean reports and closed files. The trailhead was empty when he reached it. No trucks, no troopers, no tablets full of numbers, just the mountain and the last man willing to keep believing there was still something on it worth finding. Silas Hargrove looked up at the ridge line silhouetted black against a sky just beginning to bruise toward morning and said the only thing that felt true enough to say out loud, "I made you a promise, Marcus." The wind didn't answer. It never had. "I'm keeping it now." He started up the trail alone, boots finding the same switchbacks Nora had climbed 6 days before, carrying a debt 19 years overdue and a letter that had waited its whole life to finally reach the daughter it was written for. Somewhere above him, past 3 ridge lines and a canyon the search maps had already given up on, a woman who refused to stop being her father's daughter was still breathing, still counting her breath the way she'd been taught, still waiting, though she didn't know it yet, for the one person on this earth who was never going to stop looking, and for a truth that had been circling both of them for 19 years, closing in slowly, the way weather closes in over a mountain that never asked for any of it. The sun hadn't fully cleared the eastern ridge yet. The light was still the thin gray of a morning, undecided about what kind of day it wanted to be, and Silas climbed into it anyway, one slow step at a time, 66 years old and carrying a promise heavier than the pack on his back. Behind him, the search camp slept on, oblivious, its tablets and its probability curves and its careful language, all still waiting for a morning briefing that would find the trailhead empty and one old man already gone. Ahead of him, the mountain waited too, patient, indifferent. The same mountain that had taken a father from a daughter 19 years ago in a story nobody had bothered to tell right, and was about to find out one switchback at a time that some men don't know how to stay retired when it matters most. His knees complained with every rise in the trail. His lungs burned thinner with every 100 feet of elevation, and still he climbed because somewhere above him a debt was waiting to be paid, and because some promises don't care how old the man keeping them has gotten. Silas kept climbing. Day 6. Nora didn't know it was day 6 anymore. Days had stopped being days somewhere around the second sleepless night, folding into a single long stretch of cold and hunger and the particular kind of exhaustion that made her hands shake even when she held them perfectly still. She'd found a hollow beneath an overhang 2 ridges east of the ravine, half a cave, half a mistake of geology, and she'd been living in it since the storm passed. Rationing water from a runoff trickle, rationing the last of her energy bars into pieces small enough to make them last, though last for what, she wasn't entirely sure anymore. Her ankle had swollen to twice its size the second night. She'd wrapped it with strips torn from her undershirt, tight enough to stabilize, not tight enough to cut circulation, the way she'd been trained to do it, hands moving through the motions on their own because her mind had stopped being reliable somewhere around hour 30. She pressed her palm against the stone wall of the hollow and closed her eyes. 6 days. 6 days and nobody's coming. Except that thought scared her enough that she opened her eyes again fast because sitting with it too long felt like a door she didn't want to walk through. Focus. Assess. Survive. Her grandfather's voice, worn smooth by 2 decades of memory, the same 3 words he'd drilled into her before every hunting trip, every long walk into weather that could kill a careless person twice over. Focus. She had water. Enough for maybe another day if she was careful. She thought back to the training exercises that had taught her water discipline in the first place, a grizzled instructor at Fort Benning who used to say that most people who died of dehydration in the field died with water still in their canteens, too afraid of running out to actually drink what they had. Fear made people hoard the wrong things. She'd learned that lesson at 22, and it had never once stopped being true. Assess. She had a busted ankle, 3 cracked ribs from the fall in the ravine, and a growing certainty that whoever had shot at her wasn't going to stop looking just because the storm had. Survive. She had 1 working weapon, 4 rounds, and a piece of radio equipment she'd pulled from the wreckage of the shed before the shooting started, the one with the serial number that made her stomach drop every time she looked at it. She looked at it now, because looking at it was easier than looking at the truth underneath it. The radio wouldn't power on. Dead battery, cracked casing, water damage from the storm. Useless as a communication device. Except it wasn't useless as evidence. Nora turned it over in her hands, running her thumb along the serial prefix scratched half away, and felt the same cold recognition she'd felt in the shed 3 days ago settle deeper into her chest. This isn't civilian. This isn't even standard Army issue. This is my father's unit. She'd spent 8 months with that file memorized, every blacked out line, every redacted name, and somewhere in the part of her mind that never fully stopped being a soldier, a part clicked into place that made her stomach turn over entirely. Because the unit designation on her father's file, the 1 line the sensors had missed, matched the housing pattern stamped into this radio's casing, which meant whoever sent men up this mountain to shoot at her wasn't reacting to a broken sensor. Which meant they were protecting something that had been sitting quiet on this ridge since 2007. Which meant her father hadn't died in Anbar province at all, not the way the file said, not clean, not simple. Except that's insane. Except insane doesn't explain 3 armed men converging on a hillside with tactical spacing and a spotter, and a phrase like extraction, like I was cargo, like this had already been planned before I ever climbed this trail. She set the radio down, pressed her palms flat against her thighs to stop them shaking, and made herself breathe the way she'd taught 100 younger soldiers to breathe in the field. 4 counts in, hold, 4 counts out, until the shaking slowed to something manageable. Okay, she told herself, okay. If they're protecting something, that something is close. Which means I'm not done climbing. Which means I have to move again, and moving with 3 cracked ribs and a busted ankle is going to hurt in ways I don't have words for yet. She almost laughed. The sound came out broken, more cough than laugh. Great, perfect, exactly the kind of plan Dad would have hated. Except he wasn't here to hate it, because somebody had made sure of that 19 years ago. There was a decision sitting underneath all of it, one she hadn't let herself fully name until now, crouched in a stone hollow with a dead radio in her lap. She could try to disappear. Could work her way east, away from the facility, away from whoever was hunting her, and hope to find a road, a ranger station, some version of rescue that didn't require her to walk deeper into the thing that had killed her father. Or she could do the opposite. Because whoever was up here protecting this site had already decided she was a threat worth killing, which meant they were watching for her to run, which meant the one thing they wouldn't expect, the one thing that might actually crack this open, was a woman with nothing left to lose, choosing to walk toward the danger instead of away from it. Bait wasn't a word she liked. It made her sound like something smaller than she was, something passive waiting to be used. But she understood, sitting there with her ankles screaming and her ribs grinding with every breath, that there was a version of bait that wasn't passive at all, a version that chose the ground it stood on, a version that made the hunters come to her on terms she controlled, instead of terms they'd already written for her in a briefing room somewhere. If they wanted her dead badly enough to send a team, they wanted her dead for a reason. And reasons left evidence. She didn't have to run from that evidence. She could go find it and let them come try to stop her. Steady is a decision, she thought, not a gift. She checked her weapon, 4 rounds, not much of an arsenal. Enough, maybe, to buy the time she needed. She moved at first light using a broken branch as a crutch, her wrapped ankle screaming with every third step, and made herself climb anyway, because staying in the hollow meant staying a stationary target on someone else's schedule, and she'd rather be a moving target on her own. The ridge above her opened into a wide shelf of exposed granite, scattered with old equipment housings, half buried in scree, rusted and forgotten, in a way that told her this site had been abandoned once, deliberately, and reactivated more recently deliberately again. And there, half collapsed into the hillside, was a door. Not a shed door, not equipment housing, a blast door. Military-grade, rusted at the hinges, ajar just enough to suggest someone had been through it recently and hadn't bothered sealing it properly on the way out. Nora stood at the threshold, a long moment, her heart doing something complicated in her chest, some mixture of terror and a strange sick relief, because whatever was behind that door was the answer to a question she'd been asking for 8 months. This is it. This is the thing they killed to protect, which means it might be the thing that killed him. She pushed the door open with her good shoulder and stepped into darkness that smelled like rust and old paper, and something colder underneath, both something that reminded her absurdly of the smell inside her father's old footlocker, the one her mother kept in the garage for 6 years before finally sending it east. Her flashlight found a narrow corridor, concrete walls, a single hanging light fixture, dead, and beyond it, a room. Filing cabinets. Dozens of them. Some rusted shut, some standing open, drawers gutted, papers scattered across the floor in a pattern that suggested someone had come through here in a hurry, taking what mattered and abandoning the rest. Nora crouched carefully, ribs protesting, and picked up the nearest scattered page. The room smelled like 19 years of neglect dust thick enough to taste, the particular mustiness of paper that had sat undisturbed in darkness long enough to forget it had ever been meant for anyone's eyes. A single dead moth lay curled in the corner of the nearest cabinet drawer, and somewhere behind the walls water dripped at slow, irregular intervals, the sound of a mountain slowly working to reclaim something men had built inside it. Operation Crosscut. Personnel roster, 2007. Her father's name was the third one down. Beneath it, a name she didn't recognize, and beneath that one, she did, though it took her a full 3 seconds to place it because seeing it here, in this context, in this room, made absolutely no sense at all. S. Hargrove, medic attached. Silas. Silas was there. Silas was there when my father died. The realization hit her like a second fall down a second ravine, worse this time because there was no storm to blame it on, no adrenaline to soften the landing, just cold concrete and a piece of paper with a name on it that reorganized her entire understanding of the last 19 years in the space of a single breath. He knew. He's known this whole time. Every card, every Thanksgiving, every quiet cup of coffee on my porch when I came back broken and shaking, and he knew, and he never said a word. She sat back against the cold concrete wall, the page trembling in her hands, and let herself feel it just for a moment. The specific betrayal of discovering that the one person who'd stood by her unconditionally for 6 years had been standing on a foundation of silence the whole time. Except something in her, the trained part, the part that had learned to separate fact from feeling under fire, made her keep reading instead of collapsing into the feeling entirely. Because attached didn't mean responsible. because a name on a roster didn't tell her what actually happened, and because if Silas had been there, Silas might be the only living person who could tell her the truth.
If he's willing, if he's still alive to ask, if I survive long enough to ask him.
She folded the page into her jacket next to the radio and kept moving deeper into the room, flashlight sweeping across drawer after drawer until it caught on something that made her breath stop entirely. A photograph. Curled at the edges, water-stained but unmistakable.
Her father. Younger than she remembered him, standing in desert fatigues beside a man she didn't recognize, older, a colonel's insignia on his collar, both of them smiling in a way that suggested the photo had been taken before whatever happened. On the back, in handwriting she recognized instantly, because it was the same handwriting on every birthday card she'd ever received before she turned 7. Colonel Reeve. If anything happens, he'll make it right. M.V. Reeve. The same name from the commendation letter. The one she'd carried in her memory for 8 months without ever being able to picture the face behind it. A colonel her father had saved. A debt he'd sworn to spend his career repaying, except her father hadn't written this note like a man trusting an old friend. He'd written it like a man leaving instructions in case an old friend couldn't be trusted anymore. Nora stared at the name until it stopped looking like letters and started looking like a door. Somebody named Reeve made a promise to my father, and 19 years later that promise is either the reason I'm still alive or the reason I'm about to die on this mountain. She sat with the photograph a long moment, feeling the shape of a question she couldn't yet answer. A man her father had saved. A man her father had also near the end stopped trusting completely. Two things that shouldn't fit together and somehow in the space of 19 years clearly had. She tucked the photograph into her jacket beside the roster page and the radio, a small, growing collection of evidence that felt for the first time since the shooting started less like proof of her own danger and more like a weapon she could actually use. If Reeve was still alive, if Reeve was still up here, still protecting whatever this facility had become, then the same instinct that had made her choose to climb toward the danger instead of away from it told her exactly what came next. She wasn't going to hide the evidence. She was going to make sure whoever was hunting her knew she had it. Silas Hargrove had forgotten how much his knees hated altitude. He was 3 hours up the trail, moving at a pace that would have embarrassed him 20 years ago, and satisfied him completely now given the alternative, given the ache in every joint that reminded him with each step that 66 was not 26, no matter how much his stubbornness insisted otherwise. He stopped at the ravine Nora had wedged herself into 6 days earlier, though he had no way of knowing that yet, and crouched at its mouth, studying the ground with the particular attention of a man who'd spent decades reading terrain the way other people read faces. Scuff marks. Faint, but there. A boot print, half erased by rain but not fully gone, toe pointed east, deeper on the left side than the right. Favoring an injury, left side, ankle probably, given the depth pattern. He allowed himself exactly one breath of relief before the discipline clamped back down. Because a print 6 days old told him she'd survived the first night. It didn't tell him she'd survived the other 5. He kept moving east, following a trail only someone who'd spent 40 years reading terrain would have noticed at all, and let his mind do the thing it had been avoiding since the moment he loaded his rifle before dawn. He let himself think about Marcus. Not just the last morning, the years before it, too, the ones he rarely allowed himself to visit anymore, because visiting them made the last morning hurt more instead of less. Marcus teaching him to fish in a river outside Fort Riley, patient with a city kid who'd never held a rod before. Marcus's laugh, loud enough to fill a mess tent, the kind of laugh that made other men laugh along with him, even when they didn't know the joke yet. Marcus, 3 days before the accident, showing Silas a photograph of Nora at her 6th birthday party, cake smeared across her face, and saying with a pride that still ached to remember that she was going to grow up tougher than either of them. He hadn't been wrong about that part, at least. Anbar Province, 2007. A morning that had started like every other morning of that deployment, hot before sunrise, dust already hanging in the air like something with intent. The training exercise wasn't supposed to be dangerous. That was the whole point of it. A controlled demonstration of a new extraction protocol. Low risk, high visibility. The kind of thing commanders like to run when they wanted good footage for a briefing back home. Except protocols didn't account for equipment failure. And equipment failure didn't account for a colonel who'd insisted on running the exercise a second time, faster, sloppier, because the first run hadn't looked impressive enough for whoever he was trying to impress. Silas had been 47 feet away when it happened. Close enough to see it, too far to stop it. He'd reached Marcus in under a minute, his medic training taking over before his mind fully processed what his eyes had seen, and he'd worked for 11 minutes on a man he'd known for 6 years. A man who'd been at his own daughter's christening. A man whose blood pressure he'd checked 100 times in 100 quieter moments. And none of it had mattered because some wounds didn't care how fast you worked. 11 minutes. And then nothing he did mattered anymore. He remembered Colonel Reeves' face afterward, gray, older than his years, standing over the body with an expression Silas had spent 19 years trying to interpret and never quite managed. Grief, certainly, but something else too. Something that looked, in the worst moments of Silas's memory, almost like calculation. The strange thing, the thing Silas had never fully made peace with, was that he'd genuinely believed Reeves' grief was real that morning. He'd seen the man's hands shake, seen him kneel beside Marcus's body afterward and stay there long after the medevac had already loaded the stretcher, saying something too quiet for Silas to hear. That was the part that made this all so much harder to sort into simple boxes. A villain was supposed to feel like a villain. Reeve had felt that morning like a man in genuine anguish over a debt he could never fully repay to a soldier who'd once saved his life in Fallujah. Except grief and guilt could live in the same man right alongside self-preservation, and Silas had spent 19 years slowly understanding that the second one had won. "This can't be what it looks like in the report," Reeve had said, quiet, urgent, gripping Silas's shoulder hard enough to bruise. "Do you understand me, Sergeant? This exercise was approved at the highest level. If it goes into the record as equipment failure during an unauthorized second run, careers end, programs end, and Marcus's family gets a smaller pension and a bigger scandal instead of a hero's funeral. Is that what you want for them?" Silas hadn't wanted that. So he'd signed what they told him to sign, and he'd carried the weight of that signature for 19 years, sending cards every anniversary, showing up on porches when the guilt got too heavy to hold alone, doing everything except the one thing that might have actually mattered, telling the truth. And now his daughter's out here somewhere, hurt-hunted because a coordinate in a folder finally asked the question I never had the courage to answer myself. Silas stood at the edge of the ravine, breath fogging in the cold morning air, and made himself a second promise to add to the first. If I find her alive, I tell her everything, whatever it costs me. Whatever she thinks of me afterward, she deserves the truth more than I deserve her forgiveness. He climbed for another hour before the terrain forced him to stop and reassess a wall of loose scree blocking the most direct route east, and he stood there a moment, catching his breath, letting his eyes trace the ridgeline above him for an alternate path. That was when he saw the smoke. Not much of it. A thin gray thread rising from somewhere below the next ridge, the kind of smoke a careful person makes when they need warmth but don't want to be seen. Small, contained, deliberately kept low. His pulse jumped, despite 40 years of training telling him not to hope too hard before he had confirmation. He moved toward it anyway, faster than his knees wanted to allow, and found 20 minutes later the cold remains of a fire built inside a stone hollow ash, still faintly warm under his palm, and beside it, unmistakably, a strip of torn fabric that matched the color of a jacket he'd seen Nora wear 100 times. She'd been here. Recently. Alive enough to build a fire, disciplined enough to keep it small. Alive enough he let himself hope to still be alive now. He kept moving faster now, the ache in his knees fading beneath something closer to adrenaline than he'd felt in years, following a trail of small, deliberate signs that told him a trained soldier had passed this way. broken branches at ankle height positioned like trail markers instead of accidents. A rock cairn, 3 stones stacked with careful precision, the kind of marker taught in escape and evasion courses to signal direction to anyone trained enough to recognize it. She wasn't just surviving anymore, Silas realized. She was leaving a trail, on purpose, which meant she wasn't running from whoever was hunting her. She was daring them to follow. 40 minutes down the mountain, Reyes woke to an empty camp and a radio that wouldn't stop crackling with a question he didn't have an answer for. "Command wants confirmation on Hargrove's location," the voice on the other end said, flat, impatient. "He missed the morning check-in." Reyes stood in the gray light outside his tent, looking at the spot where Silas's truck had been parked the night before. Now, nothing but tire tracks pressed into frost-hardened dirt, and felt something shift in his chest that he didn't have a name for yet. Not quite guilt, not quite fear, something adjacent to both, the specific unease of a man realizing the story he'd been told to enforce might not be the whole story after all. He'd followed procedure for 5 days. Told himself procedure existed for a reason, that survivability curves and resource allocation weren't cruelty, just math. The kind of math that kept search teams from dying alongside the people they were looking for. He'd believed that mostly, right up until an old medic with shaking hands and a debt in his eyes had looked at him and asked who actually signed the stand-down order. Reyes hadn't answered that question. He still didn't have an answer he was willing to say out loud. He pulled up the authorization chain on his tablet instead, scrolling past the layers of bureaucratic language until he reached the digital signature at the very bottom. The one he'd been told not to question. The one that had come down from an office 3 levels above his own with a speed that had struck him as strange even at the time. Colonel F. Reeve, Red Advisory Capacity Search Parameter Authorization. A retired colonel didn't have authority to end an active search, except somebody with enough weight behind his name clearly did, and Reyes had spent 5 days following orders from a man who wasn't even supposed to still be in a position to give them. He thought about the gutted equipment shed, the bullet hole in the steel doorframe that wasn't in his report because someone above him had told him in careful procedural language exactly what belonged in the record and what didn't. He thought about the photographer who documented the scene and then, strangely, never sent him copies of half the images taken that day. Reyes had spent his whole career believing that following the chain of command was the same thing as doing the right thing. Standing alone in an empty camp at dawn, staring at a name that had no business signing what it signed, he understood, for the first time in 5 days, that those 2 things might not be the same thing at all. He grabbed his own pack, radioed the state troopers to hold position and wait for his return, and started up the same trail Silas had taken hours earlier, alone, unauthorized, chasing a question that procedure had never once let him ask out loud. Because somewhere on that mountain an old man and a missing woman were walking toward an answer Reyes should have gone looking for 5 days ago. And he wasn't about to let his own career-shaped cowardice be the reason nobody official ever found out what it was. Nora heard the footsteps before she saw the shape, and every trained instinct in her body went rigid at once, weapon rising, 4 rounds left, breath held. The shape moved wrong for a hunter, too careful, too deliberate. Not the confident stride of a professional converging on a target, but the searching, methodical pace of someone actually looking, checking terrain features, pausing at exactly the kind of natural cover a hurt person would use. She almost called out. Except 6 days of being hunted had taught her not to trust almost. She waited, weapon steady despite the tremor in her hands, until the shape passed close enough for the growing daylight to catch the edge of a familiar profile, a familiar way of carrying weight through the shoulders that she'd recognize anywhere, that she'd know, blind, that she'd been seeing across Thanksgiving tables and porch steps for 6 years. Silas. Her voice came out, cracked barely a whisper, but the mountain was quiet enough that it carried, and she watched him freeze mid-step, then turn slow, careful his own weapon, lowering the instant recognition crossed his face. Nora. Just her name, nothing else.
but the way he said it, the way something in his 66-year-old shoulders seemed to physically buckle with relief, told her everything about the 6 days he must have spent not knowing. He crossed the distance between them faster than his knees should have allowed, dropping into a crouch beside her, his hands moving over her with the efficient urgency of a medic assessing damage before he let himself feel anything else. "Ankle," she said before he could ask. "Ribs, maybe cracked. Dehydration. I'm okay. You're not okay," he said, flat, certain. The voice of a man who'd assessed 1,000 casualties and wasn't going to let politeness cloud his judgment now. "But you're alive, which is the only thing I actually needed to be true." She let herself lean into him for exactly 3 seconds, the first physical comfort she'd allowed herself in 6 days, and then pulled back because there wasn't time for comfort. Not yet. Not until she said the thing that had been building in her chest since she found that roster page. "You were there," she said, "in 2007, when my father died." Silas went very still. "You knew," she said, "this whole time, every card, every visit, you knew what really happened and you never—" "I know," he said. Just that. No defense, no explanation yet, just 2 words that landed heavier than any excuse could have. "I know, Nora, and I've spent 19 years telling myself I'd tell you when the time was right. Except the time was never right, because telling you meant admitting what I let myself become to protect a man who never deserved the protection." "Reeve," she said. Silas's eyes sharpened, surprised. "You know that name? I found a photograph. In a bunker, 2 ridges up, my father's handwriting on the back. He wrote Reeve's name down, like it mattered, like it was supposed to protect me somehow. And a commendation letter from before he died. Reeve wrote it, said my father saved his life in Fallujah." Silas closed his eyes. "That's true," he said. "That part's true. Reeve owed your father everything. And for a while I think he actually believed repaying that debt was the most important thing in his life. Except my father's dead." "Yes. So whatever Reeve promised him, I don't know what it means anymore," Silas said, and for the first time since she'd known him, his voice actually shook. "I thought I understood Reeve's promise as guilt, as a man trying to make right what he'd broken, but if there are still armed men on this mountain 19 years later, protecting whatever's in that bunker, then guilt isn't what's driving this anymore. Then what is?" Silas looked past her toward the ridgeline, toward the direction the shooting had come from 6 days ago, his expression settling into something older than grief, something closer to dread. "Then it's not guilt at all," he said. "It's a cover-up that's still active, which means Reeve isn't protecting your father's memory. He's protecting himself." They sat with that a moment, the wind moving through the pines around them, carrying the particular cold of a mountain morning that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to be beautiful or dangerous. "There's something else," Nora said. "Something you should know before we go any further." "What?" "I wasn't running from them. Not the last 2 days. I found this bunker yesterday, and I could have kept moving east, tried to find a road, waited for someone to come save me the way people are supposed to get saved. I didn't. I left markers instead, cairns, broken branches, a visible fire. I wanted whoever's out there to know exactly where I was." Silas stared at her. "You made yourself bait," he said. "I made myself a decision," she said. "Same as you climbing up here alone instead of waiting for a search team that already gave up. If they want this buried badly enough to kill me, then the only way to stop them is to make them show themselves trying. I can't do that by hiding in a hole for the rest of my life." Something in Silas's expression shifted, an old soldier recognizing another old soldier's logic even through the fear of it. "That's either the bravest thing I've heard in 19 years, he said, "or the most reckless." "Why not both?" He almost smiled. Almost. "Your father would say the same thing," he said. "God help me, he'd probably be proud of it." "You should have told me," she said somewhere in the next stretch of trail, the words coming out sharper than she intended, though she didn't take them back. 6 years.
6 years of coffee and cards, and you sitting on my porch after I came back from deployment shaking, and you never once—" "I was a coward," Silas said, simple, unflinching. "I've been a coward for 19 years. Nora and I don't have a version of this conversation where that isn't true. I could tell you I was protecting you. I could tell you I didn't know how. Both of those things are true, and neither one changes the fact that I let you grow up believing a lie because telling you the truth would have cost me the only family I had left after your father died." "That's not fair to say. It's the truth, which is worse than fair." She didn't have an answer for that, not yet. The betrayal sat in her chest, real and heavy, but underneath it something else sat too. Something that recognized the particular courage it took for a man like Silas Hargrove to say I was a coward out loud on a mountainside to the one person whose forgiveness he had the least right to expect. "Why now?" she finally asked. "Why tell me now and not 6 years ago, or 6 months ago, or—" "Because you're not the only one who found that folder," Silas said. "Because somebody up here is scared enough of the truth to put 3 armed men on this ridge, and whatever they're protecting, Nora, it's bigger than my guilt. It's bigger than your grief. And I am not going to let you die on this mountain not knowing what actually happened to your father." Nora looked at him a long moment. "Okay," she said finally. Okay, let's finish this. Together." The bunker looked different in full daylight, the blast door catching morning sun at an angle that revealed scoring marks along its hinges, fresh, recent. The marks of a door that had been forced open more than once in the last week. "Somebody's been back," Silas said, crouching to examine the marks. "Since you were here last." "Looking for what?" "Whatever you didn't take." They moved inside together, Silas's flashlight sweeping the filing room where Nora had found the roster page, and this time, in the fuller light of a second pass, they saw what the first search had missed. A second door. Set into the back wall, disguised as another filing cabinet until you noticed the hinges, the deliberate concealment, the kind of engineering that only made sense if what was behind it mattered more than everything in the outer room combined. Silas pulled it open. Beyond it, a smaller chamber, a single desk, a single chair, and a wall of monitors, dark now, powered down, but wired into a server rack that hummed faintly, still running, still drawing power from somewhere, still active. "This isn't an abandoned facility," Silas said quietly, and Nora heard something in his voice that hadn't been there before. Fear, maybe, or recognition. "This is a facility somebody's been actively maintaining for 19 years. On the desk, a single folder, unmarked, sitting exactly where someone had left it deliberately, as though whoever used this room last had wanted it found. Nora opened it. Inside, a single photograph, recent, not 19 years old, showing a man in his 70s, silver-haired, standing on what looked like the same ridge they were standing on now, flanked by 2 men in tactical gear. She recognized the face instantly, though she'd only ever seen it in one other photograph, curled and water-stained, tucked now inside her jacket pocket.
"That's him," she whispered. "That's Reeve."
"He's still alive," Silas said, and his voice had gone somewhere cold and hard that Nora had never heard from him before, not once, not in 6 years of Thanksgivings and porch step coffees. 19 years. And that son of a bitch is still alive, still standing on this mountain, still protecting whatever this place actually is. Behind the photograph, a single typed page, unsigned, dated 3 days ago. Sensor malfunction, resolved internally, asset containment ongoing. If subject reaches chamber 2, authorize final measures. Nora read it twice before the meaning fully landed, before the cold, clinical phrase, final measures, rearranged itself into something with teeth. "They know we're here," she said. "They've known since the moment you walked into that shed 6 days ago," Silas said. "This whole time, Nora, you weren't hunting for evidence in the dark. You were walking into a trap that already had your name on it before you ever climbed this mountain." "Then it worked both ways," Nora said, "because I baited them out here just as much as they baited me in." Silas moved to the server rack, scanning the humming machinery with the wary attention of a man checking a wound for infection. "This thing's still transmitting. which means whoever's monitoring it already knows 2 people are standing in Chamber 2 right now. How long before they get here? If they're smart, and they clearly are, they were already close. He checked his rifle's chamber, an old habit. His hands performed faster than his mind could keep up with. Minutes, maybe less. Nora tucked the folder into her jacket alongside the roster page and the photograph, feeling the weight of evidence pressed against her ribs like something that might actually matter more than the pain radiating from the bone beneath it. "If this goes wrong," she said, "somebody needs to know what's in this room." "Nobody's dying in a filing room, Nora." "That's not what I said." He looked at her, understanding, arriving slow and unwelcome. "You want to leave a copy behind. In case, she agreed. Just in case. They worked fast, Silas photographing pages on a cracked phone screen while Nora kept watch at the doorway, her weapon steady despite the tremor that never fully left her hands anymore, both of them moving with the economy of people who'd learned a long time ago in very different corners of the same war, exactly how much time a crisis actually gives you before it stops giving you any time at all. Behind them in the outer room, a door creaked, then another. Silas's rifle was up before Nora finished turning his 66-year-old body, moving with a speed that belonged to a much younger man, and for one suspended second, the two of them stood back to back in a hidden chamber built to keep 19 years of secrets buried, listening to boots cross concrete toward them from more than one direction. "Nora," Silas said, low, urgent, every trace of the guilt-worn old man gone from his voice, replaced by something forged in a war that predated her entire existence. "Whatever happens next, whatever they say to try to stop us, we finish this together." She checked her weapon. 4 rounds, broken ankle, cracked ribs, and behind her, finally, after 6 days alone on a mountain that had tried everything in its power to bury her the way it had buried her father, someone who wasn't going to stop looking. "Together," she said. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and a voice, calm, aged, terribly familiar from a photograph that had waited 19 years to be seen, spoke through the darkness. "Hello, Nora," Colonel Reeves said. "You look so much like your father." For a moment, neither Nora nor Silas moved. The server rack hummed on behind them, indifferent, and somewhere past the doorway, boots shifted their weight on concrete, patient, unhurried, the sound of men who believed they already controlled everything that was about to happen next. "I've been waiting a long time to say that to you," Reeves said, his voice carrying the particular calm of a man who'd rehearsed a moment for 19 years and finally found the nerve to have it. "Longer than you'd believe." "You've had 19 years to say it?" Nora called back, her weapon steady despite everything in her body screaming to be anything but. "You chose silence instead. Same as him." She didn't look at Silas when she said it, but she felt him flinch anyway. "Silence was a mercy once," Reeves said. "I'm not sure it still is." "Then stop hiding behind a door and tell us what it was supposed to be a mercy from," Silas said, his voice carrying an authority Nora had never once heard from him in 6 years of quiet coffee mornings. "Tell her what you told me not to say, Frank. Tell her yourself, for once, instead of paying other men to keep it buried." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Nora's pulse climbed with every second of it, 4 rounds in her weapon, a debt 19 years overdue standing at her back, and somewhere beyond a rusted blast door, an old man finally deciding whether 19 years of silence was worth one more day. "Open the door," Reeves said finally, quiet now, almost gentle. "I think it's time we all stopped pretending this mountain has anywhere left for any of us to hide." Silas's hand found the door's edge, and Nora watched him hesitate there. 19 years of silence compressed into the half-second before his fingers actually moved, before a debt he'd carried since Anbar Province finally came due in a way neither procedure nor guilt could postpone any longer. "Whatever he says," Silas murmured low enough that only she could hear it. "Whatever he offers you, don't trust the first version. Reeves spent 19 years learning how to make the truth sound like mercy." "I know how to spot a lie, Silas. I learned from watching you tell one for 6 years. It landed the way she meant it to.
He didn't flinch this time.
He nodded instead, accepting it the way a man accepts a debt he knows he still owes, and pulled the door open the rest of the way. Gray morning light spilled into the chamber from somewhere beyond it, the first real daylight either of them had properly stood in for what felt like a lifetime. And there, framed in the doorway, exactly as the photograph had shown him, stood Colonel Frank Reeve. Older in person than his picture suggested. Smaller somehow, the way powerful men sometimes were once you finally stood close enough to see them without the myth attached. Behind him, 2 armed men held their positions, weapons lowered but ready, waiting on a word from a man who'd spent 19 years deciding exactly which words got said out loud and which ones stayed buried in a mountain built to keep them that way. Reeve's eyes moved from Nora to Silas and back again, something unreadable passing behind them. Grief or calculation or both at once. The same expression Silas remembered from a training field in Anbar province 19 years ago. "You found the letter I never sent," Reeve said, looking at the photograph now visible at the edge of Nora's jacket. "Your father was right not to trust the version of me that came after Fallujah. I've spent 19 years wishing he'd been wrong about that." "Then tell us why," Nora said, weapon still raised, ribs screaming, ankle throbbing, 6 days of survival compressed into a single, unshaking demand. "Tell us everything, right now, before one more person on this mountain has to die for whatever you've been protecting." Somewhere behind Reeve, far down the ridge they'd all climbed by such different, difficult paths, a 4th figure was still moving through the tree line unnoticed, unauthorized, chasing the same truth from a different direction entirely. Reeve drew a slow breath, the kind a man takes when he already knows the next words out of his mouth are going to cost him everything he has left. "Sit down," he said. "Both of you. It's time you heard the whole of it." "Sit down," Reeve said. "Both of you. It's time you heard the whole of it." Nora didn't sit. Neither did Silas, but the weapon in her hand lowered an inch, not from trust, but from the particular exhaustion of 6 days spent bracing for a fight that had finally, impossibly, arrived somewhere she could actually see it coming. "You look so much like your father," Reeve said again, softer this time, almost tender, which was somehow worse than if he'd shouted it.
"Don't," Nora said. "Don't you dare say his name like you have any right to it."
"I have every right to it." Reeve's voice didn't rise, didn't need to. "I built this facility to honor what your father died for. I have carried that cost for 19 years so that men like him would never die for nothing." "He died because you ran a broken exercise twice," Silas said. Flat, final. "Because you wanted better footage for a briefing. Don't dress that up as honor, Frank. I was there. I held him. I know exactly what he died for, and it wasn't this." Something moved behind Reeve's eyes, fast, gone almost before Nora caught it. There, that's the crack. That's the place that actually hurts. "You signed the report," Reeve said to Silas. "You signed it willingly." "I signed it because you told me his family would lose everything otherwise. Pension, honor, a funeral with dignity instead of a scandal attached to his name forever. I believed you. I was wrong to believe you, and I have spent 19 years choking on that mistake." "It wasn't a lie," Reeve said. "Not entirely." "Then what was it, entirely?" Reeve's jaw worked once, twice. He's deciding what version to tell, which means every version so far has been a version. Which means the truth is still locked somewhere behind that pressed collar, and I don't know if I have the rounds left to make him open it. "The program didn't die with your father," Reeve said finally. "That's the part I never let myself say out loud, not even to the mirror. Crosscut kept running. Under different funding lines, different names, buried deeper every year because shutting it down meant admitting he died for a mistake instead of a mission. I told myself continuing the work honored him. I told myself that lie so many times it started sounding like truth." "What exactly was Crosscut supposed to do?" Nora asked. "I've read that redacted file 200 times and it never once told me what it actually was." Reeves' eyes moved to the dead monitors on the wall as though he could still see something projected there that only he remembered. "Extraction protocol testing," he said. "Rapid casualty recovery under fire, using terrain like this to simulate mountain deployment zones we couldn't openly train for. Your father volunteered because he believed the data would save lives in exactly the kind of terrain where evacuation windows are shortest and mistakes are most fatal. He wasn't wrong about the value of it. He was wrong about who'd end up running it after he was gone."
"And the second run?" Silas said. "The one that actually killed him. Walk her through it, all of it, not the version you fed the report." Reeves' jaw tightened.
The exercise called for a simulated extraction under a 90-second window, using a mechanical winch system rated for the load with margin to spare. The first run went clean.
"Slower than I wanted."
I called for a second run to tighten the timeline before the funding committee arrived the next morning. I told the equipment team to shave load-bearing tolerances to hit the faster time. I was told the margin was still safe. He stopped, started again quieter. "I didn't verify that myself. I trusted a number on a spec sheet instead of trusting the men whose lives depended on it being right."
The winch failed at load. Marcus was clipped into the harness when it did.
"Say the rest of it," Silas said. Reeve closed his eyes a moment, the kind of pause that belonged to a man rehearsing a confession he'd never actually planned to give out loud. "The rest of it," Reeve said, "is that I knew within the hour that the failure traced back to my order to shave the tolerance. And instead of owning that in the official record, I let it become a story about equipment age and unfortunate circumstance, because owning it meant the program died with him, and some selfish, cowardly part of me couldn't accept that his death would mean nothing had been built." "It already meant nothing," Nora said, voice shaking now, not from fear. "The second you decided your program mattered more than telling the truth, everything you built on top of that decision was built on his silence, not his sacrifice. You didn't honor him. You used him." Reeve didn't argue. He simply stood there and let the accusation land the way a man stands in weather he knows he deserves. "Except, it never was," Silas said, finishing the thought Reeve hadn't been able to.
"No," Reeve said. "It never was honor. It was fear wearing honor's uniform."
"I understand the difference now. Understanding it 19 years too late doesn't make it any less true." The chamber went quiet except for the server rack's faint hum, a sound too mundane for a room holding this much weight. "Why the men on the ridge?" Nora said.
"If you were just protecting a program, not a body, why shoot at me at all?"
Reeves' eyes flicked toward the server rack, toward the dark monitors, dead and silent now, holding whatever remained of 19 years' worth of secrets inside, circuitry that would soon be dismantled for good. "Because I'm not the one who authorized that," he said, and something in his voice cracked in a way that sounded for the first time like it wasn't performance.
"I signed the stand-down order. I've been trying to reach this facility for a week to shut it down before somebody else decided you were a liability that needed a permanent solution."
"I'm retired, Nora. Advisory capacity only. I still have a name people listen to. I don't have the authority I used to have, and I have spent 5 days finding out exactly how little that authority is actually worth."
"Someone above you," Silas said.
Slow, understanding arriving like a held breath finally released. "Someone with a lot more to lose than an old man's guilty conscience," Reeve said. "I don't fully know who anymore. That's the truth, and I know how it sounds. I built something I couldn't control, and then I spent 19 years too afraid to find out what it had become without me."
"That's not an answer," Nora said. "That's an excuse wearing an answer's clothes."
Reeve looked at her, something flinching behind his composure. "You're right," he said. "It is. The honest answer is that funding for Crosscut got folded into a classified line item 11 years ago that I no longer have full visibility into. I know the money still flows. I know someone still signs off on maintaining this facility. I stopped being the one who decides what happens here a long time before you ever found that folder, Nora. I just never stopped being the one whose name is attached to it." "Then whoever's really running this is still out there?" Silas said, which means shutting down today doesn't actually end anything.
It ends my part of it, Reeves said. And it gives you both something to bring to people who can actually investigate the rest. That's not nothing. I know it doesn't feel like enough. Nora's stomach dropped. He's not the enemy. Except that doesn't mean the enemy isn't still out there. Which means this conversation just bought us time, not safety. The chamber's lights flickered once, then again. That's not the weather, Silas said, already moving toward the door, rifle up. No, Reeves said, and for the first time since he had appeared in the doorway, something like fear crossed his face. Real fear. The kind that made 70 years look suddenly very old. That's someone accessing the system remotely. Which means they know we're here. Which means, Nora said, forcing herself up despite her ankle, despite her ribs, we're out of time to sit and talk. Reeve turned to his two men. Get them out, now, west exit, the one that clears the ridge without crossing open ground. You're helping us? Nora said, not quite a question, not quite believing it either. I've spent 19 years failing to help anyone who mattered, Reeves said. I'm not ending my life failing your father twice. They moved fast, faster than Nora's body wanted to allow, Silas half carrying her through a service corridor she hadn't found on her first pass. Reeves' two men clearing each junction before waving them forward, radios crackling with chatter that made every hair on Nora's arms stand up. Multiple contacts inbound, one of the men said. West Ridge, they're not ours. How many? Reeve asked. Command channel says 6. Command channel also says containment is authorized. Containment. That word again. The same word from the typed page. Final measures. Nora's blood went cold in a way the mountain air alone couldn't explain. They're not coming to talk, she said. No, Reeve said. They're coming to make sure none of us walk off this mountain able to tell anyone what we know. The corridor opened onto daylight blinding after the concrete dark, and Nora blinked against it, disoriented, until her vision cleared enough to recognize exactly where they'd emerged. 40 minutes behind them, on a switchback neither Nora nor Silas had any way of seeing, Reyes climbed alone, lungs burning in a way 5 years behind a desk hadn't prepared him for. His service weapon, heavier on his hip than it had felt in a decade of mostly signing paperwork instead of carrying it into anything that mattered. He'd found the second boot print an hour earlier matching Silas's tread exactly, and had followed it with the single-minded focus of a man trying to outrun his own 5 days of complicity. He kept replaying the moment Silas had asked him who authorized the stand-down, kept hearing his own voice answer, "That's not information I'm cleared to share," and understanding with each labored step upward that being cleared to share something and being willing to find out the truth were two entirely different kinds of courage. And he'd only ever practiced the first one. He thought climbing about the 12 years he'd spent building a career out of careful language and procedural distance, the promotions that had come from never once making a decision nobody above him could later disown. He'd told himself that was competence. Standing alone on a mountain at dawn, chasing a truth he should have chased 5 days earlier, he understood it had actually been cowardice wearing a badge. The exact same cowardice Silas had worn for 19 years, and Reeve had worn even longer. 3 different men across 3 different decades, all choosing the same quiet, comfortable version of failing someone who deserved better. Radio chatter crackled against his hip official channels, reporting contacts converging on a ridge he was still 40 minutes from reaching, and Reyes pushed harder, past the point his knees wanted to allow, because for the first time in a 5-day search that had cost him nothing but paperwork, something finally felt like it might actually cost him something worth paying. He thought of his own daughter, 11 years old, waiting for him back in Cheyenne, and understood with sudden clarity exactly what kind of father he wanted to be able to tell her he'd been on the worst week of somebody else's life. The cliff. The same wide granite shelf where she'd first found the blast door, except now, standing at its edge, she could see the full drop below, 300 feet of raw rock falling away into shadow, the sky above just beginning to lighten at its edges. Night, finally starting to surrender to something like morning. Dawn,
6 days, and dawn is finally arriving like it has anything left to apologize for. Gunfire cracked from the tree line before she finished the thought. Silas pulled her down behind a boulder, his body covering hers on instinct, even at 66, even with knees that had complained the entire climb, and returned fire with a precision that made her understand in one sharp flash of clarity exactly how he'd survived 4 decades of exactly this.
2 shooters, 10 o'clock, he said, voice flat, professional. The guilt-worn old man completely gone, replaced by whatever version of him had existed before 19 years of regret wore him down. Reeves' men are pinned near the equipment shed. Reeves' own men returned fire from the shed's cover, one of them shouting coordinates into a radio that no longer seemed to be reaching anyone who mattered. The chaos of the exchange, fracturing into the particular confusion of a firefight where nobody fully knew anymore whose side everyone standing on this ridge actually belonged to. Nora peered around the boulder's edge, sidearm ready, 4 rounds, and did the math her grandfather had drilled into her since she was 9 years old. Angle, distance, wind. 4 rounds, 2 shooters visible, 2 more unaccounted for. Her hands weren't steady enough. Except steady was never a feeling. It was a decision. Her grandfather's decision, living now in her hands.
"Cover me," she said. "Nora, cover me, Silas. I can make this shot. You know I can make this shot." He looked at her one long second, something passing between them that was equal parts terror and trust, the specific trust of 2 people who'd spent 6 days believing the other one dead and finding out impossibly that they hadn't been. "Make it count," he said. She rose from cover in a single motion, breath held the way her grandfather taught her on cold granite decades ago. Steady is a decision, not a gift, and put her last 4 rounds exactly where they needed to go. 2 shooters down. A 3rd round answered from somewhere she hadn't accounted for, close enough to spray granite chips across her cheek, and Nora dropped back behind the boulder with her heart hammering and an empty weapon that suddenly felt like nothing more than dead weight in her hand. "Empty," she said. "I've got you," Silas said, already moving, already firing, covering the last stretch of open ground between them, and better cover with a discipline that belonged to a much younger man's body. He fired twice more, adjusting his stance, the way 40 years of muscle memory demanded, and Nora watched a man who'd spent 6 years pouring coffee on her porch instead become, in the space of 90 seconds, the version of himself he must have been in Anbar province 19 years ago. Calm under fire in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with training that never fully left a body once it was earned. A round sparked off the boulder inches from his shoulder, and he grunted more surprise than pain and dropped back into cover beside her. "You hit?" she asked. "Graced. I've had worse from a fishing hook." He checked his rifle's remaining rounds with a glance that told her the count wasn't good. "1 shooter left that I can see. Might be more in the tree line we can't." That was when the 4th voice arrived from the tree line behind the remaining shooter, sharp and official and entirely unexpected. "Federal agent, drop your weapon, Reyes." He'd found the trail hours behind. Silas had climbed alone and unauthorized through the same switchbacks, arriving at exactly the moment his presence mattered most, weapon drawn, badge raised. 5 days of procedural caution finally burned away by the sight of an old medic and an injured woman pinned down under fire on a cliff his own search had abandoned. The remaining shooter hesitated just long enough, just exactly long enough, for Silas to close the distance and end the hesitation permanently. Silence, for one suspended heartbeat broken only by wind moving across the cliff edge and the growing gray light of a morning that had taken its time arriving. Reyes crossed the clearing at a run, weapon still raised, eyes taking in the scene with the particular shock of a man realizing every assumption in his official report had been catastrophically wrong. He'd trained for scenarios like this in academy courses years ago, tabletop exercises that never quite prepared a person for the actual weight of a cliff edge, actual blood on actual granite, an actual woman he'd written off in a status report 4 days ago, now standing in front of him, alive, breathing, furious, and somehow still steady enough to have made the shot that started ending this. "You're alive," he said to Nora, and something in his voice cracked with a relief that surprised even him. No thanks to your 72-hour survivability curve, Silas said, though there was less heat in it now than there would have been 5 days ago. I know, Reyes said. I know. I found the authorization chain this morning. Reeves' signature. Advisory capacity, no operational authority, and command let him end an active search anyway.
I should have asked that question 5 days ago instead of following the file like it was scripture.
You're asking it now, Nora said. That counts for something. Reeves' men mopped up the remaining contacts within minutes, the fight ending as fast as it started. 6 days of hunted exhaustion collapsing into a stillness Nora almost didn't trust. She lowered her empty weapon and let herself sink back against the boulder, ribs screaming, ankle screaming louder, and felt Silas's hand find her shoulder, steady, warm, real. It's over, he said. Is it? She said. Or is there another version of Reeves' containment order sitting on someone else's desk right now? Maybe, Silas admitted, but it's over for today. And today is the only day I let myself worry about anymore. Reeve approached slowly, favoring one leg, a graze along his forearm, bleeding through a torn sleeve, and stopped a few feet away, looking down at Nora with an expression that had shed every trace of the composed colonel from the chamber below. Your father would be proud of that shot, he said. My father would be furious it ever had to happen at all, Nora said. So would I. Reeve nodded, slow accepting the correction without argument. The morning light had shifted while they spoke, climbing higher over the ridge, warming the granite beneath them just enough to notice, as though the mountain itself had decided the worst of its part in this story was finally over. There's something else, he said. Something I should have given you the day you first started asking questions instead of letting you find your own way to this cliff. He reached into his jacket, produced a worn envelope, edges soft with age, and held it out to her with a hand that wasn't entirely steady. Your father wrote this the night before the final validation run, Reeve said. He gave it to me to hold, in case anything happened. He trusted me to make sure you got it. I told myself for 19 years that giving it to you would only reopen a wound that had finally started closing. That was a lie, too. The truth is, I was afraid of what it would say about the man I let myself become after he died. Nora took the envelope, her name in her father's handwriting unmistakable, the same handwriting from every birthday card before she turned 7. You kept this for 19 years, she said. The letter you never sent. I was a coward, Reeve said, simple, unflinching, the same admission Silas had made on the trail 2 days earlier, and somehow hearing it twice from 2 different men who'd carried the same weight in different directions made something in Nora's chest finally start to loosen. Beside her, Silas reached into his own jacket, slower, and drew out the second envelope, the one he'd carried against his chest since before dawn, the one addressed not to Nora, but to a dead man who would never read it. This one's mine, he said. I wrote it to your father, never had the nerve to burn it, or bury it, or do anything except carry it year after year, like carrying it was the same thing as actually saying what's in it. He held it out, not to Nora exactly, but to the space between all 3 of them. Maybe it's time both letters stopped being something people just carry. She opened her father's letter first, with hands that shook for reasons that had nothing to do with cold or adrenaline. Nora, if you're reading this, something went wrong, and I'm sorry for that more than I have words to say. You're 7 years old as I write this, which means you won't understand most of what I'm about to tell you for a long time. Maybe you're reading this as an adult now. Maybe you found it because you went looking, because you're stubborn, like your grandfather, like me. I need you to know something. Whatever story gets told about how I died, I believed in what we were building here. I believed it would save soldiers' lives, real lives, the kind of lives that matter more than a single funding meeting or a single impressive demonstration. If something went wrong tomorrow, it wasn't because the work was wrong. It was because someone got impatient with doing it carefully. I need you to forgive Silas, whatever he ends up telling you, whatever he ends up not telling you. He's a good man. carrying an impossible weight. And if he's still in your life when you read this, it's because he never stopped trying to make things right, even when he didn't know how. And I need you to know this most of all. Whatever happens, whatever gets buried or covered or lied about, you were the best thing I ever built. Better than any program. Better than any mission. I love you more than any classified file will ever be able to say, and I am so proud of the woman I already know you're going to become. Steady is a decision, sweetheart, not a gift. You already know that. Your grandfather taught you well. I love you. Always, Dad. Nora read it twice before she let herself cry, the tears coming finally after 6 days of survival mode, holding every feeling at bay after 19 years of a grief she'd never fully been allowed to understand. Silas's hand tightened on her shoulder. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to, because some grief doesn't need company to be less heavy. It just needs to finally be allowed to exist. She thought of the camping trip again, the fire crackling low, her small hand disappearing inside his. I've got you. She understood now, reading his handwriting on a Wyoming cliff 19 years later, that he'd meant it as a promise that would outlast his own body, a promise written into a letter he'd trusted a flawed, frightened man to eventually deliver, because even flawed, frightened men could sometimes eventually do the right thing, if given enough time and enough reason. She folded the letter carefully, the same careful motion her father must have used folding it the night before he died, and pressed it against her chest a moment, feeling 19 years of silence finally settle into something closer to peace than grief. When she could speak again, she looked at the second envelope, still resting unopened in Silas's hand. "Read it," she said, out loud, to him, not to me. Silas looked at her a long moment, surprised, and then slowly nodded, understanding what she was actually asking him to do. He opened the envelope with hands that shook more than hers had, and read it, not to the mountain, not to Reeve, not even fully to Nora, but to the memory of a man he'd failed to save fast enough 19 years earlier. "Marcus," he read, voice rough. "I keep telling myself I'll send this someday, which is a coward's way of saying I never will. I let them tell me what to write in that report. I've spent every year since then showing up at your daughter's door instead of telling her the truth because showing up felt like enough, and it was never enough. I'm sorry I didn't fight harder that morning. I'm sorry I signed what they told me to sign. I'm sorry it took your daughter almost dying on this mountain for me to finally find the nerve to finish this letter. You'd be so proud of her, Marcus. She's steadier than either of us ever were." He folded the letter with careful hands and looked at Nora, something unguarded in his face for the first time in 6 years of careful, guarded coffee mornings. "That's the truth," he said, "all of it, however long it took me to say it." The sun cleared the eastern ridge fully as the last of Reeve's men secured the equipment shed, gold light spilling across the granite shelf, catching the drop below in a way that made the whole mountain look for just a moment like something worth surviving for. "What happens now?" Nora asked. "To the program. To you." "I'm turning myself in," Reeve said. "Full disclosure. Whatever the cost, whatever it means for whatever's left of my career or my freedom. 19 years of silence has cost more than I ever imagined it would. I'm done paying that particular debt in installments." "And the men who shot at us today?" "Agent Reyes has the authorization chain," Reeve said. "Their commanding structure will be exposed along with everything else. I promise you that, Nora. Not because I've earned your trust, because it's the only decent thing left for me to do." He looked older suddenly, the composed colonel, entirely gone, just a 70-something man standing on a mountain that had finally stopped being able to keep his secrets. "There will be a hearing, congressional oversight most likely given how deep the funding trail runs. I won't pretend I know exactly how it ends for me. I've spent so long controlling the story that I'm not entirely sure how to stop even now, even wanting to." "Then don't control it," Nora said. "Just tell it. All of it, exactly the way you told it to us in that room. That's all anyone's ever really owed anyone else in this whole mess." Reeve nodded slowly, something like relief crossing his face at being given for the first time in 19 years permission to simply stop managing the narrative. Reyes stepped forward, tablet already out, already documenting the careful bureaucrat replaced by something closer to the investigator he'd apparently always wanted to be underneath the procedure.
"I'll make sure of it personally," he said. "You have my word for whatever that's worth to you after this week."
"It's worth something," Nora said. "You climbed a mountain alone to find out the truth instead of just following orders. That's more than most people manage in a lifetime." They made it down the mountain 3 hours later, Nora leaning on a splint Silas fashioned from a fallen branch and a torn strip of his own jacket, the two of them moving slow, careful, unhurried in a way that felt earned after 6 days of nothing but urgency. The official search vehicles were still parked at the trailhead when they emerged from the tree line the state troopers Reyes had left behind, staring at the procession with the particular shock of men watching a closed file walk itself back open. "She's alive," one of the troopers called into his radio, disbelief thick in his voice. "Repeat, subject is alive and ambulatory." Nora looked back once up at the ridgeline, now fully lit gold by a sun that had finally completely arrived, and felt something settle in her chest that hadn't been there in 6 years. Or maybe 19. She couldn't fully tell anymore. Where one grief ended and the other began. She spent 4 days in a hospital in Casper, ribs, wrapped ankle set, dehydration corrected with an IV drip that felt after 6 days without enough water like the strangest kind of luxury. Silas visited every one of those 4 days, coffee in hand out of habit, even though the hospital served its own, sitting in the same chair by the window without ever quite explaining why he needed to be there, and Nora never asked him to explain it, because by the second day, she'd stopped needing him to. On the second night, unable to sleep, she found him still in the chair, past visiting hours, having apparently talked his way past a nurse who clearly hadn't had the heart to send a 66-year-old man back out into a Wyoming parking lot at midnight.
"You don't have to stay every night," she said.
"I know," he said. "I'm staying anyway. Same reason I climbed that mountain. Some debts don't get smaller just because the worst of the dangers passed." "Is that what I am to you? A debt?" He considered the question longer than she expected. "You're the daughter of the best man I ever served with," he said finally.
"And you're becoming something else too.
Somebody I actually want to know, not just somebody I owe." I didn't expect that second part. I'm grateful for it anyway. Her mother arrived on the third day, flying in from Kansas, with a face Nora hadn't seen since the funeral. The particular pale stillness of a woman who'd spent 19 years building a peace she'd never fully trusted and had just watched crack open in a single phone call.
"I should have told you about the letter,"
her mother said, sitting on the edge of the hospital bed, her hand finding Nora's over the blanket. "The half-burned one? I've carried the guilt of not telling you for so long I forgot there was a version of this where telling you actually helped instead of hurt." "You didn't know what it meant," Nora said.
"Neither did I for 8 months. Some things you can't carry alone, Mom, not because you're weak, because nobody's built to carry them alone."
Her mother cried then, the kind of crying that had clearly been waiting 19 years for permission, and Nora held her hand through it, understanding for the first time that her mother's silence and Silas's silence had grown from the same soil. 2 different people trying to protect her from a truth neither of them believed she could survive. Both of them wrong about exactly how strong she actually was.
"He would be so proud of you," her mother said once the crying eased. "Both of you. All 3 of you, actually, if I'm honest, about how much of this you did together."
"I'm still not sure how I feel about Silas," Nora admitted. "About what he kept from me."
"You don't have to be sure yet," her mother said.
"Some forgiveness takes longer to arrive than other kinds. That doesn't mean it isn't coming."
"How did you carry it?" Nora asked.
"Not knowing, or knowing enough to be afraid and never letting yourself ask the rest." Her mother was quiet, a long moment looking down at their joined hands, the hospital's fluorescent light making both of them look older than they were, tired in a way sleep alone wouldn't fix.
"I told myself I was protecting you," she said finally.
That's what everyone tells themselves, isn't it? Silas told himself that. I told myself that. Even Reeve, from what you've described, probably told himself some version of that for 19 years. But I think the truth is simpler and less flattering. We were protecting ourselves from having to watch you carry something we weren't sure you could survive.
We were wrong about that. You were always going to be stronger than any of us gave you credit for.
I wish you'd trusted that sooner.
So do I, her mother said.
I don't know how to give you those years back. I only know how to stop taking any more of them from you starting now.
3 weeks later, Nora stood at Arlington for the third time in her life, her ankle still in a walking boot, her ribs still tender under a jacket she'd chosen specifically because it was warm enough for a morning that had turned unexpectedly cold. Silas stood beside her. He'd been there for every day of her recovery, the same way he'd shown up on her porch 6 years ago, uninvited, unasked, simply present in the specific way that mattered most. Her father's headstone looked the same as it always had. White marble, a name, 2 dates, a silence that used to feel unbearable and now somehow felt different. Not less painful, just less alone.
I used to hate coming here, Nora said. It made the lie feel more real, not less. And now I know the truth.
Which doesn't make the grief lighter, but it makes it mine instead of theirs.
Silas nodded quietly, the two of them standing together in a silence that had finally, after 19 years, stopped needing to hide anything. He'd be proud of you, Silas said. Not for the shot on the cliff, for everything after it, for choosing to forgive an old man who took too long to find his courage.
I haven't fully forgiven you, Nora said. Honest, steady.
Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. I know. But I'm not walking away, either. I know that too. She reached into her jacket, pulled out her father's letter, worn now from 3 weeks of being read and reread, and set it gently against the base of the headstone, weighted down with a small stone from the mountain that had almost killed her and had, in the end, finally given her something she'd spent 19 years without.
The truth. And someone who'd never stopped looking.
Steady is a decision, she said quietly to the stone, to the morning, to the father she'd finally fully understood. Not a gift. Beside her, Silas Hargrove, 66 years old, carrying a debt finally paid in full, said nothing at all. He didn't need to. Some promises don't end with words. They end with simply finally still being there. Behind them, at the far edge of the cemetery, a gray sedan pulled up and idled, and Reyes stepped out alone. No tablet this time, no procedural language, just a man who'd climbed a mountain once and had apparently decided it wasn't the last hard thing he intended to do right. Colonel Reeves' disclosure hearing starts Monday, he said, approaching slowly, respectful of the moment he was interrupting.
Full congressional review. Programs being shut down permanently. I thought you'd want to hear it from someone who was actually there instead of reading it in a headline.
Thank you, Nora said, and meant it.
How's he holding up? Silas asked.
Reeve. Older, Reyes said. Quieter. He's cooperating fully, which counts for something even if it can't undo anything.
I think some part of him is almost relieved to finally be answering the questions instead of managing them.
That sounds about right, Silas said quietly. 19 years is a long time to carry a story nobody's allowed to ask you about. Longer still to finally set it down. I also came to tell you something else, Reyes said.
Something I probably should have said on that cliff instead of waiting 3 weeks to work up the nerve.
He glanced at Silas, then back at Nora. I put in for a transfer. Investigative Oversight Division. Somebody needs to make sure decisions like the one I almost made never get made again without someone asking the right questions first.
Nora looked at him a long moment,
then at Silas. Two very different men who'd each, in their own overdue way, finally chosen courage over procedure. Good, she said. The world could use more people who climb the mountain instead of waiting at the bottom of it. Reyes nodded, something almost like peace settling into his shoulders, and after a moment excused himself, leaving them alone again among the white stones, the gray sedan pulling away, slow and quiet down the cemetery road. 6 weeks after that, Nora climbed the trail to sensor Array 7 for the first time since the shooting, her ankle finally free of its boot, her ribs healed enough that the mountain air no longer caught painfully in her chest with every deep breath. The Forest Service had reassigned the relay station's maintenance to a different contractor entirely. The old equipment shed, rebuilt, clean, and new. No trace left of gutted wiring or bullet-scarred steel, as though the mountain itself had already started the long, patient work of forgetting. Silas climbed beside her, slower now on the switchbacks than he used to be, though neither of them mentioned it. Both of them simply accepting the pace the mountain demanded of a body 66 years into carrying itself up and down places like this. "You didn't have to come," Nora said at the second overlook, where the whole valley spread out gold and green below them, ordinary and beautiful in a way that felt almost stubborn after everything the ridge above them had tried to bury. "I know," Silas said. "I wanted to." They reached the observation post an hour later, the same steel container disguised as a maintenance shed, and Nora stood at its door a long moment before going in, remembering the version of herself who'd left through this same door 6 weeks ago, with a whiteboard note that said nothing true about where she was actually going or why. The container looked smaller than she remembered, the way places from a crisis always seemed to shrink once the crisis itself had passed. Ordinary steel and ordinary dust, and the coffee maker still sitting exactly where she'd left it, unplugged, patient, waiting for a version of her life that had gone on without noticing how much had changed. Inside, she wrote a new note, not for anyone else this time, just for herself, in handwriting that had steadied considerably since the last time she'd held a marker in this room. "Back by dark, and this time I mean it." Silas read it over her shoulder and almost smiled, the real kind, the kind she hadn't seen from him in longer than she wanted to admit. "Your father used to leave notes like that," he said. "Different words, same promise underneath them." "Maybe that's the part that actually gets passed down," Nora said. "Not the skills, not even the grief, just the promise underneath everything. Steady is a decision, not a gift," Silas finished. Outside, the wind moved through the pines the way it always had, carrying no grudge in it anymore, just the ordinary, patient weather of a mountain that had finally, after 19 years, let go of everything it had been asked to bury. Nora Vance stood in the doorway a long moment, watching the light change over the ridge, and felt for the first time in longer than she could remember entirely and completely steady. Below her, the valley stretched out in every direction, ordinary and vast, and utterly unconcerned with everything that had happened on the ridge above it, the way mountains always were indifferent, not out of cruelty, but out of a patience so much larger than any single human grief that it simply couldn't be rushed, couldn't be argued with, could only be climbed one switchback at a time by anyone determined enough to keep going. She thought about all the versions of herself the last 2 months had required. The soldier who'd once carried a rifle into places most people never imagined. The daughter who'd carried a redacted file in her chest for 8 months, afraid of what asking might cost her. The survivor who'd spent 6 days turning a mountain's hunger into her own kind of weapon. And now this version, standing in a doorway with steady hands and an old friend beside her, finally, not carrying any of it alone. "I used to think steady meant not being afraid," she said, mostly to herself, though Silas was close enough to hear it. "I don't think that anymore. I think it just means deciding to move anyway." "Your father figured that out a long time before either of us," Silas said. "Took me 19 years to catch up. Some lessons take longer to land in an old soldier than they should. I'm grateful this one finally found me before it was too late to matter." "Better late," Nora said, "than never." He smiled at that. The real kind again, worn in around the eyes, in a way that made him look for just a moment less like a man carrying 19 years of guilt and more like the friend who used to show up on porches with coffee and nothing to say. Exactly the amount of something that had always somehow been enough. Together, they closed the door of the observation post behind them and started back down the mountain toward a valley gone gold and green and ordinary in the afternoon light, toward a life that finally, after everything, belonged entirely to the people choosing to live it honestly.